We're going to do this a little bit quicker because we're going a little over. But I figured, in the spirit of revisiting things, that it might be worthwhile to bring up the gem tonight, because there's a story here that I think is very worthwhile and important for us to sort of get into. Understanding the world around us, not so much out of sympathy for the rich and powerful, but just sort of understanding the movements that are happening in capital right now so that we can be better prepared to react. And what am I talking about? Times are not good for Silicon Valley finance. In 2020 alone, over 30 FinTech companies launched in the United States. And what is FinTech? FinTech is a product undoubtedly of an era of cheap money. What do I mean by cheap money? When interest rates, which are effectively set by the Federal Reserve, are really low, it becomes very cheap to borrow money, which allows you to sort of fuel companies with lots of capital. But it's always sort of reliant on this fact that money for the investors initially is very cheap for them to acquire. And again, remembering the kind of two-tiered system that we live in this country, monetary policy affects us all, but affects us very differently. When monetary policy is extremely lax, the rich and powerful get incredible opportunities to find ways for them to make a buck. For us, it means that you have these kind of inflationary pressures, right? Things like, think about like when we talk about rental markets in this country and how BlackRock was able to go around the country and buy up houses in the past few years, despite the fact that housing prices were extremely high. They were able to sort of get access to this because they made a calculation that, what, the interest rates are low enough for us that we will make money on the other side of this as prices go up on our investments. So that's what kind of loose monetary policy creates. Now, for us, when the interest rates go up, that means your car payment goes up. That means all the credit card loans that you have go up, and it becomes harder and harder for you to get access to capital. Right. So it's a two-tiered system in the sense that while money was cheap, it's not like we were really living through the benefits of that. But as a monetary policy is sort of tightening, as the Federal Reserve raises rates, that means that we are the first people on the chopping block to be hit. So FinTech really is a product of cheap money. And again, what do I mean by FinTech? Financial technology services. So tech companies that are trying to ride this wave of speculation and cheap money to provide services like small loans to consumers. Maybe to make this really clear to people, because there's a lot of things in the tech industry, it's usually smoke and mirrors bullshit. They're like, oh, we have a computer, it's a tech company. Think about companies like Affirm, right, which basically floats you $300 so that you can buy a coffee machine or something like that and pay that off over the period of a year. Highly speculative, highly risky endeavor, and also obviously also highly predatory on people. Or also companies like Robinhood is another fintech company. And there's plenty of others who found a way to sit on things that are either outlawed in general, right? Like a lot of the Bitcoin stuff that we saw crash recently, or ways that they can sort of ride this wave of financial speculation and providing loans and things like that to people because money is cheap, and sort of tying it to an app or something. And then people are like, well, this is different, instead of just being increasingly speculative and dangerous activity happened by a few folks. But what we're seeing right now is that industry is suffering from a few things. One, lack of profits, right? And there's always going to be a promise of some profits, but a lot of these companies, like Uber, for example, one of those things is just, we all know this story by now, Twitter, all these, Amazon, for example, at the early stages, they don't make money. But now, because the monetary system is tightening, people are starting to look, a little bit deeper and seeing, oh, wow, this is a very shoddy business model. Or, oh, Lord in heaven, this is an outright scandal and an illegal operation that, we don't want to be invested in. So as all of these, the lack of profits, some of the examination of these companies have smashed this previously growing industry, as investors are worrying that at the end of the era of cheap money and tightening is going to mean a hurt to their returns of investment in these companies. A Financial Times analysis found that shares in FinTech have fallen an average of 50% since the beginning of 2022. And if you compare this to what was happening in the industry in 2021, because so many people were locked at home and buying things, This really led to significant growth. And for a lot of these companies, on average, they were growing at something like 1,000% revenue growth in a year, which is massive. And remember that it's not just like the new kids on the block. Even companies like PayPal are getting hit by the system. Another example, a private company, right? So it's not public, but Klarna, they've been hit too. They slashed their valuation from earlier this year at $46 billion to $7 billion. So fintech is being hit hard by the era of cheap money that allow these things to profit and to be attractive to investors, and really bring in a lot of people into their schemes and scams. Like we've done big, breakdowns, for example, of Robinhood, but also these kind of small time loan companies are extremely predatory as well, because they're sort of sitting for people who don't have access to credit in the form of like a credit card, right? Which again is not an angelic industry either. But they're finding the people who are sort of left out of that and charging them 30% interest rate on small payments, right? Which is just a way to sort of prey upon the unequal system that we're living in, right? But that's how capital goes. And the point here is that we're seeing this huge shedding, and Lord in heaven, I skipped over like the headline here. FinTech as an industry has lost $500 billion this year in valuation, which is not a small amount of money. $500 billion. So this is a very significant shift. And I wanted to talk about a little bit just to remind folks that this is just the tip of the spear. These companies have always been overvalued. And if you read financial press, well, you would hear people who would push it. Those old guys in bow ties would say, hey, the fundamentals aren't the fundamentals of these companies are very, very shoddy, and people should be worried that if the economic system ever changes or the economic calculations ever change, that these companies will be the first ones to signal a significant reduction in economic growth. We got to be worried about what is going to happen as debt starts to be collected. Because as much as inflation is a crisis, and it certainly is, inflation hits working people far harder than it does rich people. Remember, I talked about this yesterday. When they're looking at Times, the New York Times just came out with a big survey, and the rich voters, they don't list the economy as a priority. It's not too surprising. And it's poor working class voters, and particularly working class voters of color, who are saying that this is a big threat. And the reason I bring that up is because you hear all this stuff about inflation, and certainly inflation will, annoy some rich folks. But it's much, much more of a pressing issue for people like us. But I also hate to be the bearer of bad news. We should also be paying attention to this systematic crisis in debt, and that's the global debt crisis. So total global debt this year, 352% of gross domestic product in the first quarter of this year. And the private sector debt is accounting for 2/3 of this. I know a lot of people have been very predispositioned to hearing any kind of conversations about debt and sort of, turning their head and ignoring it. And don't get me wrong, like a lot of the austerity stuff that you get from the right is nonsensical. But you also have to remember that all of these systems, from the private industry to governments, have been relying on the access to cheap money. And it's extremely worrying when the private sector is set up in a way that they are reliant on cheap, cheap, cheap money. This is a decades long business strategy, not just in the United States, but across Europe and a lot of developing countries as well. And it can have disastrous consequences. Financial Times also estimates that 17% of companies in industrialized economies are quote unquote zombies, or entities that can only be kept alive by virtue of low rates. And remember what we mean there: only be kept alive by virtue of rates. And that means for the other 80% or so of companies, it also means that they are relying on debt as well, but the threat is not so big that it will completely collapse them. But a lot of these companies that we've seen sort of rise up in the past few years have been reliant on this access to cheap capital. And as the monetary system is shifting, the likelihood of immediate consequences of people losing their jobs. We saw that with everyone's least favorite boy, Elon Musk, moving people from across the country to Austin, Texas, and then laying off 10% of his workforce. And remember, that company is not a car company. That is a speculation company. So it's not surprising that they were hit harder and earlier than Toyota or Ford or GM. but this kind of belt tightening is coming. And if we thought that the conversation about unemployment and inflation were bad, just wait till rich people and investors start saying we need to start seeing much more significant returns on our investment when companies do not have access to cheap capital to kind of placate this class of people. This is, I don't have the answer necessarily, other than the big things that we talk about, a complete reorganization of this system so that we aren't beholden to debt speculators and dangerous people like Elon Musk with our livelihood. But these are the kind of things that I think it's really crucial that socialists be paying attention to, because there is significant movement right now happening in the capital sphere. And capital and politics are intertwined. And it's not going to be surprising as we start to revive the zombie of austerity politics in the next few years to deal with the debt crisis that has been looming for years. And not to be all like, I told you so. Um, but I remember in like one of the early gems that I did on TMBS talking about the debt crisis and saying this is a huge exposure where if this policy ever changes, we're going to see very, very severe consequences for working people. And a lot of folks said, well, we can always borrow more. But the problem is, as the interest rates go up, that decision becomes harder and harder and harder to make for people who just want to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. And we really need to be prepared for this new era that we're entering into.
What do you think like the solutions are to this? Like it's a, we talk about like if Bernie gets in but the economy looks shitty, right? You're sitting on top of a bomb that isn't easy to diffuse. Like is there what might people look toward?
One thing, in addition to like overcoming the court, one thing that has to happen is we need to, the Federal Reserve is already politicized. People say it's depoliticized. That's bullshit. It's politicized in favor of the rich. And we need to push back against this idea that, oh, it just operates outside of politics, because one, it doesn't. And two, it's extremely dangerous. So we need central bank policy that works for everyday people and doesn't start to push, quickly harsh austerity on people in the form of high interest rates. Remember too that like, people talk about the Volcker shock a lot, where Paul Volcker, who was Fed chair, pushed up the interest rates very, very high, one of the largest increases in history. And it had tremendous effects here. But also remember that all these countries around the world, they get debt from the United States, which meant that their payments went up significantly. And then who shows up to save the day? World Bank and the IMF. And what do? Privatize your industry, mass spoils of the commons, right? Like these are the kind of things that have significant effects for Americans and people all around the world. And the idea that these are outside of politics is complete bullshit. Like fixing the economy as a whole is a big task. And I'm not going to sit here and say I'm going to do it in a 5-minute clip. But like the first step has to be the ability to inject a people-focused politics into the institutions that have the power to affect as much as they do.
Yeah. So, for instance, like during the financial crisis, you don't just bail out banks. You might.
No, I mean, well, Mark Blythe said something I thought that was really good. Actually, in our Michael Brooks Legacy series, when we had Richard Wolff, Ben Burgess, and Mark Blythe on a show. And I was interviewing them, and Mark Blythe said, one thing you have to remember about the Fed policy during the during the COVID crisis is the taps only go one way, because they were only built to go one way, right? Like they were only built to prop up and send money to folks. I mean, like we've talked about some things that the Federal Reserve could be doing. For example, like the Federal Reserve in COVID bought a shitload of corporate debt, right, to make sure that stock prices were stable. Well, what if the Federal Reserve was directly giving money at zero to negative interest rates to cities and localities to buy crumbling housing, to buy large buildings, to buy trailer parks, all these kind of places that people live in, and transfer that ownership into either public ownership or owned by the tenants there? Right? Like there are things that could be done with a financial institution of that much power and leverage. But the thing is, like, it works very, very quickly in favor of the rich and powerful because it's designed to. And as Mark Blythe said, yeah, the taps go one way, and we need to be building different kind of taps.
Yeah.
Well, y'all, We got really fun stuff coming up. I think we'll be quick to hop over there. We're going to be going to the post game. Going to be joined by Ben Burgess, Danny Bessner, Gene Bajelon, um, Wozni Lambre, and Nando Villa. I think they're already waiting for us. So you can get access to that patreon.com/left reckoning. We'd really appreciate the support. And, I'll just say in closing to the public audience, I really appreciate everybody showing up. I mean, the tragedy that we've all sort of been through together has been horrifying, and it's really tough. And I miss Michael very much. And having this community and all the folks around us, and knowing that we're not in it alone, that we can continue this work, and most importantly, this spirit means a tremendous amount to me. So thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everybody.